everybody. I am Dr. Mintzi Martinez-Rivera, and it's my pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I am coming to you, well, my pronouns are ella, she, her, and I am coming to you from Pátzcuaro, the former religious center of the Purépecha Empire. And so I would like to start by acknowledging and honoring the original inhabitants of Michoacán, which are the Michoacán, Mexico, which are the Purépecha, the Ñañú, the Nahua, the Masawa, and the Pirinda communities. I especially would like to honor the Purépecha, which are my father's ancestors and from whose land I speak to you today. And it's the land also that I call home, although I am mixed. I am half Mexican and half Puerto Rican. So the two terms that I'm going to be discussing today are Native American and Indigenous. These two terms are what we call pan-ethnic labels, meaning they are labels that are umbrella labels that are encompassing or that are agglomerating, I think that's Spanglish, multiple different ethnicities together. Both Native American and Indigenous are labels that are born out of colonialism, conquest, and genocide. These are labels that were given by the Europeans, by the conquerors, as they came into this continent. And they were giving labels to the original inhabitants of, again, this continent that Abya-Yala, as the people from the Turtle Islands from Panama, one of the indigenous groups of Panama, they call this land, right? So Abya-Yala, or Pachamama, for example, coming in from the Andes. So Native American, right? It's basically referring to the original inhabitants of this continent. Is very much, again, as I already mentioned, very much coming from this colonial legacy, this very much pan-ethnic label. Indigenous, on the other hand, it comes from basically European ignorance, thinking that they had arrived to India, right? So if you're going back to your history classes, right, is that Christopher Columbus set out to discover a quicker route to India and, arrived here, and they thought they had arrived to India. So they called the original inhabitants of this continent Indians. A couple of decades later, they were like, no, we didn't arrive to India. This is a new area, right? So Amerigo Vespucci, he was like, yeah, no, this is another area. So hence America. And hence Native Americans, right? Indigenous is another, again, they were also from Indian, it went into Indigenous, right? So these terms, again, are born out of very much these colonialism, very much born out of conquest, and did not reflect what the original inhabitants actually saw themselves as or call themselves. And in the majority of the cases, actually, we lost the original either languages or original cultures because of the level of genocide that happened basically in the first 200 years of conquest and colonialism. So that in the first 200 years after the arrival of the Europeans, basically they killed 90% of the original population of this continent. So we lost in so many ways the names that people gave themselves. Something that has happened also is that in the last 30, 40 years, different indigenous or First Nations, which is another concept that is born out of the descendants of the original communities from this continent. They may call themselves First Nations or original nations. A lot of different communities have been reclaiming the way that they call themselves. So to give you again an idea from the area where I'm from, here in Mexico, the Purépechas were called Tarascos for 400 years. And starting in the 1970s, they started saying, no, we are Purepecha. Other groups, for example, the Otomi, they're like, we're Ñañú, the Seris, we're Comcac, as well as other groups. I'm more familiar with Mexico as this is my research area and this is where I've been focusing, but that has happened all over the continent, as well as obviously in the United States and Canada. Native Americans sometimes is used as a label to talk about the indigenous communities or the original inhabitants or First Nations from the United States and Canada. And the label indigenous is used to label or to talk about communities that are from Latin America or from other places around the world. So for example, in terms of the Maori they're called obviously indigenous, not Native American. However, for those of you that are very much interested in what is the correct way, right? So it really depends on the political stance of individuals. Some individuals, they will be fine with Native American. Some individuals will be fine with the label indigenous, right? But for some, they're like, no, I am our First Nation, specifically in the United States, right? Or Canada, the idea of First Nation. So in terms of to talk about, and especially as a way of erasing this idea of America, because again, America is also very much a legacy of colonial imposition to the name of this continent. We were not America before 1492. We had multiple names. And as one of my colleagues presented earlier, right, indigenous cultures had a diverse way of understanding gender, the same way that we had a diverse understanding of how to call our continent. So for some individuals, Native American is a very much a loaded term. Whereas for some, again, it's okay, right? The same way, again, for some people, indigenous is okay. And for others, it's not, it's an insult because of the colonial legacy. Some, as I was saying, prefer the term First Nation, or in Spanish, right, pueblos originarios, kind of like original peoples, original communities, would be the rough translation, although First Nation, pueblos originarios, that is the correlation in terms of, the different groups here in our continent. But another thing that I also wanted to talk about, as I was also mentioning, and somebody asked in the chat, right, these different cultural terms, is that different communities are reclaiming the ways in which they are labeling themselves. I already mentioned some of those in terms of my area in over here in Mexico, right? Giving the exercise that we're doing right now is to understand that we're coming and that we need to respect how people label themselves. So if you say, mention someone in terms of Native American or First Nation, something like that, and they correct you, that is okay, right? We're all human, we're all learning. So people have corrected me when I have misspoke when talking about different indigenous terms or using terms that were imposed by the Europeans, and now indigenous communities are using them. For example, when I met people that were from the Comcac community, but I knew them as Seris, and they were like, no, we're not Seris. That was how the Spanish called us, we're Comcac. And I'm like, okay, sorry. Thank you so much for correcting me. I'll use Comcac now, right? So this is something that is very important to understand, right? And as some of my panelists have also been mentioning, right, language is powerful, but language is always changing. So it's very important to listen. It's very important to pay attention, to be respectful to how we want to be labeled, how we want to be called. And this is incredibly important and personal for me. My father identifies as indigenous. My father identifies as Purepecha, even though his brothers, my uncles, don't. And that has to do with a legacy of colonialism and conquest, that people do not want to be identified as indigenous, as part of the original inhabitants of this continent. But for my father is very much important. So as her daughter, it's very important for me to acknowledge his legacy and part of my heritage, right? Without obfuscating my Puerto Rican heritage also. So again, all these labels are very complicated, right? As I mentioned again, to summarize, Native American and Indigenous are pan-ethnic labels that some people will appreciate them and or engage with them. Some people will reject them and prefer to be labeled based on their community terms or their nation. The way that they self-identify, and it's very important to be able to respect that. So thank you so much for listening. I'm more than happy to answer questions as they pop up in the chat. Thank you, everybody.